The neon lights never stopped flashing in Ventus Prime. Day or night, the massive city buzzed with electric energy that made your teeth ache. Down in the market district, where Dustin found himself walking that evening, the lights painted everything. In harsh blues and reds, the colors danced across wet pavement like spilled paint. This wasn't a place for tourists. This wasn't even a place for most locals. The market district sat in the belly of the city, where the artificial sun couldn't reach and the real sun had been forgotten years ago. Towering buildings stretched up so high you couldn't see their tops, their metal frames wrapped in advertisements that screamed about everything you could buy if you had the credits: cybernetic eyes, new lungs, synthetic food that actually tasted like something, memory implants, pain blockers. The signs never stopped promising, never stopped lying. The air down here tasted like burnt metal mixed with rain and something else, something sour. That made you want to cover your nose, but after a while, you stopped noticing. After a while, everything in the market district became background noise. Dustin knew this feeling well. He'd been walking these streets for months now, ever since he'd left his old life behind. His military jacket hung heavy on his shoulders, the reinforced plates hidden beneath worn fabric making him look bigger than he was. Most people assumed he was just another veteran trying to forget. They weren't wrong. His eyes moved constantly as he walked, scanning faces and shadows without really thinking about it. Old habits. In the war, not watching could get you killed. Down here, it just meant you might lose your wallet or wake up in an alley missing a kidney. The crowds moved like water around him, fast, purposeful, never stopping. Everyone had somewhere to be, something to do, someone to avoid. Eye contact was dangerous. Slowing down was stupid. In Ventus Prime, showing weakness was like bleeding in shark-filled waters. That's why the small hand tugging at his sleeve caught him so off guard. "Mister?" The voice was tiny, barely louder than the rain pattering against the metal awnings overhead. Dustin stopped walking and looked down, his hand automatically moving toward the weapon hidden in his jacket before he caught himself. A little girl stood beside him, so small she barely reached his waist. Her skin was green, the deep, rich green of the Psi people, the original inhabitants of this planet. But her color looked dull under the artificial lights, like a plant that hadn't seen real sunlight in too long. She wore a tunic that had probably been white once but was now gray with dirt and wear. It hung on her tiny frame like a tent, too big and too thin for the constant chill of the lower levels. Her dark hair was tangled, and her feet were bare on the cold, wet ground, but it was her eyes that made Dustin's chest tighten. They were too old for her face to knowing. These were eyes that had seen things no child should see. "My mama needs help," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean down to hear her. "She's real sick, and we don't got nowhere to go." Around them, the crowd kept moving. People walked past without slowing, their faces turned away, conversations continuing as if the child didn't exist. This was how it worked in the market district. You didn't see what you didn't want to see. You didn't hear what might make you feel guilty later. Dustin glanced around, his soldier's instincts still checking for threats, for traps. Street kids were sometimes used as bait by gangs looking for easy marks, but this girl didn't have the hard edge of a con artist. She just looked tired and scared and very, very young. "She cries every night since Daddy went away," the girl continued, her small hands twisting in the fabric of her tunic. "We've been sleeping outside for lots of days. The ground is so cold, and Mama won't eat the food from the trash even when I bring it to her." The words hit Dustin like physical blows. He'd seen plenty of suffering during the war, plenty of people pushed past their breaking point. But there was something about a child talking so matter-of-factly about eating garbage that made his stomach turn. He looked past her, scanning the crowd again. Where was her mother? Why was this little girl approaching strangers alone? Every protective instinct he had was screaming warnings, but he couldn't just walk away. Not from those eyes. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Your mama?" The girl didn't hesitate. She turned and pointed toward a narrow alley between two massive buildings, where the neon light barely reached and shadows pooled like dark water. "Over there." "She told me to ask for help, but everyone just keeps walking." Her voice got smaller. "I think maybe she's gonna stop breathing like Daddy did." Those words froze Dustin's blood. He looked toward the alley, then back at the child, then at the endless stream of people who kept moving past them like they were invisible. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nala," she said. Mama's name is Sahari. Are you gonna help us, mister? Please? The way she said please, so small and hopeful and desperate, made something crack inside Dustin's chest. He'd built walls around his heart after the war, had learned to keep other people's problems at arm's length. Getting involved meant getting hurt. It meant caring about things you couldn't control. But this little girl with her 2 old eyes and her bare feet was looking at him like he might be the first person in days to really see her. Yeah, he said quietly. I'll help. The relief that washed over Nala's face was almost painful to watch. Her shoulders sagged like she'd been carrying a weight too heavy for her small frame, and for just a moment, she looked like what she was, a scared little kid who'd been trying to take care of her mother all by herself. Really? She whispered. Really? Show me where she is. Nala nodded quickly and started walking toward the alley, her bare feet making no sound on the wet pavement. Dustin followed, his hand still resting near his weapon out of habit, his eyes scanning the shadows ahead. The alley was darker than the main street, lit only by the dim glow of a few emergency lights and the distant flash of neon signs. It smelled of garbage and stagnant water and something else, something sick and sweet that made Dustin's nose wrinkle. Then he saw her. Sahari was huddled beneath the overhang of what looked like an old maintenance shaft, her back pressed against the grimy wall. Long black hair fell across her face like a curtain, hiding her features in shadow. She was wrapped in a cloak that had probably been beautiful once but was now torn and stained with things Dustin didn't want to identify. Even from a distance, he could see how thin she was. Her shoulders looked sharp under the fabric, and her hands, where they gripped the cloak, were nothing but skin and bone. But when she looked up at the sound of their footsteps, Dustin felt his breath catch. She was beautiful, not in the artificial way of the enhanced women who strutted through the upper levels of the city, but in a raw, natural way that even exhaustion and starvation hadn't managed to destroy. Her cheekbones were sharp, her jawline strong, and her eyes golden like her daughter's but deeper, more guarded, held an intelligence that hadn't been dimmed by suffering. Her green skin, where it wasn't marred by dirt and fatigue, was the deep, rich color of forest leaves. She was like her daughter, one of the native people of this world who'd been pushed to the margins when the humans arrived. Despite everything, the torn clothes, the hollow cheeks, the way she hunched in on herself like a wounded animal, she held herself with a dignity that made Dustin's chest tight. Even here, in this filthy alley, even starving and desperate, she looked like royalty in exile, her golden eyes fixed on him, and he saw the calculation there, the wariness. She was used to being looked at with contempt or lust or pity. She was waiting for him to show his true intentions. I don't need your pity, human, she said, her voice hoarse like she hadn't spoken in days. But even weakened by hunger and exhaustion, there was steel in her words. Good, Dustin replied, tilting his head slightly. Because I'm not offering it. Her eyes narrowed, suspicious. Around them, the alley felt smaller, more enclosed. The sounds of the market district seemed very far away. Then what are you offering? Food, he said simply. A warm place to sleep for the night. A chance to get dry and maybe figure out what comes next. Sahari's gaze didn't waver, but he could see the internal struggle playing out behind her eyes. Pride warred with desperation. Suspicion fought against hope. She'd been hurt before, that much was obvious. She'd learned not to trust kindness, especially from humans. And what do you want in return? She asked, her voice sharp despite its weakness. The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Dustin had expected it in places like this. Nothing came free. Kindness always had a price, and that price was usually more than people wanted to pay. Nothing, he said. Nothing? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. No one does something for nothing. Not here. Not ever. Maybe I'm not from here. Sahari studied his face in the dim light, looking for lies, for hidden motives. Her daughter stood between them, looking back and forth like she was watching a tennis match, her small hands twisted together with anxiety. Mama, Nala said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, I'm so cold. The word please was so small, so fragile that it seemed to crack something in the air between the adults. Sahari's expression softened just slightly as she looked down at her daughter, and Dustin saw her resolve wavering. She reached out with a trembling hand to brush a strand of damp hair from Nala's face. The gesture was so gentle, so full of love. Despite everything they'd been through, that Dustin had to look away for a moment. You have somewhere safe? Sahari asked finally, her voice barely audible. Safe enough, Another long pause. The rain continued to patter against the metal overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. The city never slept, never stopped moving, never cared about the small dramas playing out in its forgotten corners. One night, Sahari said finally, the words forced out like they hurt to say. Just one night, Dustin nodded. One night? She exhaled slowly, and he saw some of the tension drain from her shoulders. But she was still wary, still ready to run or fight if she had to. That kind of alertness didn't come from a few bad days, it came from months or years of learning that the world was full of people who would hurt you if you let them. All right, she murmured, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. Dustin nodded once and turned toward the mouth of the alley. Come on. The walk back to his place wasn't far in terms of distance, but it felt like crossing from one world to another. As they left the chaos of the market district behind, the streets grew quieter. The neon signs gave way to dim industrial lighting, and the crowds thinned out until they were walking alone through corridors of rusted metal and concrete. Nala walked between them, her bare feet silent on the pavement. Every few steps, she would look up at Dustin with those two old eyes, as if she couldn't quite believe this was really happening. Sahari stayed close to her daughter, one hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder, ready to grab her and run at the first sign of danger. Dustin's place was exactly what it looked like from the outside, not much. A reinforced steel door set into a concrete wall, marked only by a number painted in fading white. The biometric lock was old and sometimes didn't work, but it recognized his thumbprint after the tries. The door slid open with a mechanical grinding sound, revealing a single cramped room beyond. It wasn't fancy, just a couch that folded out into a bed, a small kitchen unit in one corner, a tiny bathroom behind a sliding panel, and one window that looked out onto the industrial maze of the lower city. But it was warm. The climate control unit hummed steadily in the background, keeping the temperature comfortable, and the air smelled of coffee and metal polish instead of garbage and despair. Nala stepped inside first, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar space. Her bare feet were silent on the clean floor, and she moved carefully, like she was afraid of breaking something. This place smells nice, she announced after a moment, her voice filled with wonder. Dustin raised an eyebrow. What's it smell like? She tilted her head, thinking hard. Like, not outside. Despite everything, a small chuckle escaped him. I guess I'll take that as a compliment. Sahari lingered in the doorway, her arms still wrapped around herself like armor. She looked at the couch, then at the walls, then at him. He could see the wheels turning in her head, cataloging exits, looking for threats, trying to figure out his angle. One night, she said again, her voice firm despite its weakness. Dustin met her gaze and nodded. One night. She exhaled slowly and stepped fully inside. The door sealed shut behind her with a soft hiss, and suddenly the three of them were enclosed. In the warm, quiet space, for a moment, nobody moved. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and careful boundaries. Then Nala's small voice broke the quiet. Mama, do you think we'll ever have a home again? The question hit the room like a physical blow. Sahari's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled slightly around the fabric of her cloak. It was a long time before she answered. I don't know, my love. Dustin didn't say anything, but as he watched them watch the little girl curl up against her mother's side, seeking warmth that her mother could barely provide, he realized something. They weren't the only ones in this room trying to figure out what home meant anymore. The rain hadn't stopped. It drummed a steady rhythm against the reinforced window, and the neon lights of Venice Prime cast long, shifting shadows across the room. The city never slept, but inside this small space, something like peace had settled over them. Nala lay curled against her mother's side on the couch, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric of Sahari's cloak like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Her breathing was deep and even the first real sleep she'd probably had in days. Dustin sat in the old chair near the window, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze unfocused. The weight of the day pressed against his skull like a dull headache. But sleep wouldn't come. It never did, not easily. He should have walked away back in the alley, should have ignored the small hand tugging at his sleeve, the pleading eyes, the way Nala's voice had cracked when she talked about eating from garbage cans. He'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's problems was a fast way to get your heart broken. And yet here he was. He exhaled slowly, tilting his head back against the chair. Across the room, Sahari hadn't moved in over an hour, but he knew she wasn't asleep. She was too still, too rigid. Her breathing was too controlled, too careful. She was waiting. Waiting for what? He wasn't sure. For him to demand payment for his kindness. For him to change his mind and throw them back out into the rain. For him to show his true colors. That's what people did, wasn't it? They offered help with one hand and took something precious with the other. She shifted slightly, adjusting the thin blanket around her daughter's small frame. The movement was careful, practiced, the gesture of a mother who'd spent many nights trying to keep her child warm with nothing but love and determination. You still don't trust me, Dustin said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sahari's head turned just a fraction, her golden eyes catching the dim light from the window. Should I? Dustin huffed a quiet laugh. Probably not. The honesty seemed to surprise her. In the silence that followed, he could hear the distant hum of the city outside, the endless mechanical heartbeat of Ventus Prime. Millions of people all trying to survive, all fighting their own battles in the neon-lit darkness. Then why? She asked finally. Why do this? Why what? This. Her fingers brushed absently through Nala's tangled hair. The food, the shelter. No one else stopped. No one else even looked. Dustin let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. It was a fair question, one he wasn't entirely sure he had an answer for. Why had he stopped? Why had he let a small girl's desperate eyes crack through the walls he'd built around his heart? I guess I've seen enough people left in the gutter to know it never ends well, he said finally. Sahari's gaze didn't waver. That's not a reason. No, he admitted. It's not. She didn't press him further, and he was grateful for that. The truth was complicated, tangled up with memories of war and loss and the faces of people he hadn't been able to save. The truth was that sometimes, when you'd seen enough darkness, you started looking for any small light you could find. Minutes passed, stretching into something softer, something that almost resembled peace. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the window, and the neon lights painted shifting patterns on the walls. For a moment, it was possible to forget they were in the belly of a city that didn't care about any of them. Then Nala whimpered. It was quiet at first, just a shift in her breathing, but then her small body began to tremble, her fingers twitching against the fabric of her mother's cloak. No, the word slipped from her lips, barely audible, but laced with terror. Sahari's entire body went rigid. Nala. The girl's breathing became quicker, more uneven. Her small hands clenched into fists, and her head moved back and forth against her mother's chest. No, please, she whimpered, her voice sharp with desperation. Don't take Mama. Please don't take her. Sahari moved before Dustin could react. In one fluid motion, she was off the couch and crouched beside her daughter, her hands gripping the girl's arms gently but firmly. Nala, wake up, she urged, her voice tight with controlled panic. It's just a dream, my love. Just a dream. But Nala was deep in whatever nightmare had claimed her. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her entire small frame wound tight like a coiled spring. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. I'll be good, she cried out, her voice breaking. I'll be quiet. I won't ask for food. Just don't hurt Mama, please. The words hit Dustin like physical blows. He'd seen that kind of terror before, on soldiers fresh from battle, on refugees whose homes had been burned to the ground. But this was a child, a little girl who should have been dreaming about toys and games, not begging invisible monsters not to hurt her mother. Sahari was whispering something in a language Dustin didn't recognize, her voice, soft but urgent, as she stroked her daughter's hair. Her own hands were shaking, and he could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear of the dream, but fear of being helpless to protect her child from the memories that haunted her sleep. Nala, sweetheart, wake up, she pleaded. You're safe. We're safe. The girl jerked suddenly, her eyes snapping open. For a split second, she looked completely lost, her gaze wild and unfocused as she tried to remember where she was. Dustin had seen that look too many times, the confusion of someone torn from nightmare into reality. Not sure which was worse. Then she saw her mother's face, and some of the panic faded. She pressed her face into Sahari's chest, her small body still trembling. I'm sorry, Mama, she mumbled, her voice thick with exhaustion and leftover fear. I'm sorry I had the bad dream again. Sahari's arms tightened around her daughter, and Dustin saw tears threatening at the corners of her golden eyes. You have nothing to be sorry for, my love. Nothing at all. As he watched them, something twisted in Dustin's gut. In that split second, when Nala had been crying out in her sleep, Sahari had been ready to fight. She'd braced herself for danger like a mother expecting someone to rip her child away from her. How many times had they woken up like this? How many nights had they spent in places where nightmares were the least of their fears? What had driven them to the streets? What had happened to put that kind of terror in a little girl's dreams? Dustin exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. Bad dreams? Sahari looked up at him, something unreadable in her gaze. She remembers more than she should, she said finally. Dustin didn't ask what that meant. Didn't ask what Nala had seen. What had driven them to sleep in alleys and eat from garbage cans? What had left the girl waking up in a panic, expecting something worse than shadows? He already knew the answer would be something he didn't want to hear. Instead, he stood and walked to the small kitchen unit in the corner. The cupboards were mostly bare. He hadn't exactly been planning for company, but there was enough. He pulled out a metal container and filled a small cup with warm milk, adding a little honey he'd been saving. Sahari watched him warily as he walked back over and held out the cup. For her, he said simply. She hesitated, her eyes searching his face for hidden motives. Then slowly, she took the cup. The moment the warmth reached her fingers, something in her shoulders eased just slightly. She tilted it carefully to Nala's lips. The little girl sipped slowly, blinking sleepily, her small hands clutching the edge of her mother's cloak. Better? Sahari asked softly. Nala nodded, already drifting back toward sleep. It tastes like sunshine, she murmured. Despite everything, Sahari almost smiled. Like sunshine? Warm and golden, Nala explained, her eyes already closing. Like when Daddy used to tell stories about the old days, before the sky went dark. The words hung in the air like ghosts, full of meaning that Dustin didn't understand, but felt in his chest anyway. There was a history here, a story of loss and displacement that went deeper than simple poverty. As Nala settled back into sleep, this time peaceful and dreamless, Dustin found himself wondering about that history, about the old days and the stories of sunshine in a world where artificial light had replaced the sky, about what had happened to drive a Psy woman and her daughter to the streets of the human city. But those were questions for another time. For now, it was enough that they were warm and safe and for once, not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. It's sweet, she murmured. Good, Dustin said, leaning against the wall. Should help with the dreams. Sahari studied him for a long moment, not with suspicion, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding. Thank you. It was barely a whisper. Dustin nodded, pretending not to notice the way her hands still shook. Neither of them spoke. After that, the rain kept falling outside, washing the city clean. But inside, for the first time in a long time, there was warmth. The scent of synthetic rations still lingered in the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of the apartment's filtration system. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the world beyond the reinforced window remained drenched and mist. The streets of Indorus Prime virtually slept, yet in this quiet pocket of the city, time seemed to stretch and settle. Dustin sat at the small table, his fingers curled around a chipped metal mug, its contents long gone cold. Across from him, Sahari remained perched in the edge of the couch. Still wrapped in the thin blanket he'd given her, she hadn't truly relaxed. Not yet. Nala, now awake, sat cross-legged on the floor between them, swinging her tiny feet as she finished the last of her meal. The little girl had brightened considerably. Since last night, no longer just a fragile shadow pressed against her mother's side, but a child, a hungry, curious child who is currently inspecting Dustin's old data pad with wide, fascinated eyes. Sahari, however, remained distant, watchful. The wariness in her golden gaze had not faded overnight. Dustin leaned back, slightly studying her in return. If you're staying in my home, he said, voice steady but calm, we should probably stop pretending we don't exist each other. Sahar's fingers twitched slightly, where they rested on her lap. I know you don't trust me, he continued. I don't expect you to. But Yorkid walked up to a stranger in the middle of the market and asked for help. That means we're past the point of silence. Sahari exhaled slowly, glancing at Nala, who was now poking the edges off datapad screen, fascinated by the way it lit up under her touch. Fine, she said at last, the word reluctant but resigned. She lifted her chin slightly, as if forcing herself to make this a formal acknowledgement. My name is Sahari Dustin, nodded Dustin. A small voice piped up before he could say anything else. Nala. The little girl beamed up at him, her green eyes wide with the kind often guarded enthusiasm that children seem to possess, no matter how harsh their world was. Dustin let out a small chuckle, something easing in his chest at the sound. Nice to meet you, Nala chagrined, before glancing back down at the datapad. What's this? She asked, poking the screen again. It's an old system interface, Dustin replied, reaching over and tapping a few buttons. The screen flickered, bringing up a navigation map, faded with age, but still functional. You said to be for ship coordinates, but now it's just junk. I haven't gotten around to tossing. Nala gasped dramatically. A ship? Did you fly one? Dustin hesitated. A long time ago, he admitted. Nala's eye sparkled with something close to awe. I knew it. I dreamed about a spaceship. Remember, Mama? Remember? Sahari's shoulders went rigid. I remember, she murmured. Dustin watched her carefully. Something about that dream had unsettled her, though he wasn't sure why. Nala, oblivious to the tension in the air, continued her interrogation. Where did you go? Did you fight bad guys? Did you see other planes? Dustin let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. I traveled, he said simply. Did some things I believed in, did some things I didn't. Nala tilted her head. Do I miss it? Dustin opened his mouth, then closed it again. Sometimes, he said after a moment, but I don't think I'd go back. Nala considered this, then nodded as if she understood something far beyond her years. I wouldn't go back either, she said matter-of-factly. Sahari stiffened slightly. Dustin studied the little girl back where before, Nala said, as if that explained everything. When it was just me and Mama and everyone pretended we weren't there. The word struck something deep, something raw. Sahari looked away. Nala, she said quietly, that's enough. The little girl pouted slightly, but didn't argue. Dustin set the data pad down, rubbing his hands together before exhaling through his nose. What happened? He'd asked finally. His voice wasn't pressing, just steady. Sahari tensed, but she didn't lash out. She didn't flex for the first time. She simply looked tired. I told you already, she said, voice a quieter. Now my mate left. There was no work for our kind, no future. But you stayed. Yes. What? Sahar's golden eyes flickered toward Nala. Because she'd served more than being forgotten. Dustin's jaw tightened, and instead ended up on the streets. Sahari let out a soft, bitter breath. I thought I could endure it. Thought I could survive long enough to prove I still had worth. Dustin didn't reply right away. Instead, he glanced at Nala, still absorbed in the datapad, and then back at Sahari. You still think? You have to prove it. Sahar's fingers curled slightly against the blanket draped over her lap. I don't know anymore. The words were quiet, honest. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city beyond the window. Dustin exhaled, pushing himself up from his chair. He walked to the kitchen unit, grabbed 2 more mugs and filled them with what little instant coffee he had left. It wasn't much, but it was warm. He placed one in front of Sahari before sitting back down. She stared at it. What's this for? I don't know, Dustin said, leaning back. Maybe because you look like you could use it. Sahari hesitated, then cautiously picked up the mug. She held it between her hands as if testing its warmth. Nala, finally looking up, wrinkled her nose. Coffee is gross, Dustin smirked. You'll learn to appreciate it when you're older. Nala made a dramatic gagging noise before laughing. Sahar didn't laugh, but she did take a sip, and for the first time since she had stepped into his apartment, she looked just a little less like she was waiting for everything to fall apart. Dustin watched her carefully. They weren't gone yet, but just maybe, they weren't leaving either. The artificial morning light hummed to life outside, casting a dull glow through the reinforced window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind streets slick with moisture, neon lights reflecting in scattered puddles. Benta Prime was awake again, but inside Dustin's small apartment time moved slower. Sahari sat at the small table's holders rigid as she wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee she hadn't truly touched. She was still here. That in itself surprised him. She had made it clear one night, but now morning had come in, she hadn't bolted. Nala, on the other hand, had fully made herself at home. The little girl sat cross-legged on the floor, completely immersed in the imaginary battle she had created using Two Mismatched tools from Dustin's workbench, and then boom, she declared, slamming the two objects together, and what he could only assume was a dramatic space explosion. Dustin smirked, leaning gaggant the counter. What are you playing? Nala looked up, her dark green eyes wide with excitement. It's a space battle, she explained eagerly. This one is the captain. She's super smart and never loses a fight. Dustin nodded. Sounds like a good captain. She beamed and lifted this con object, a slightly rusted multi-tool. And this one is the grumpy mechanic, she continued. He doesn't like people, but he's actually really nice if you give him snacks. Dustin raised an eyebrow, glancing at Sahari. That's supposed to be me? Sahari let out a breath. That was dangerously close to amusement. Seems accurate, she murmured. Nala giggled, tenderly unaware of the tension that still lingered in the air between the adults, but Dustin wasn't just focused on her game now that the morning light was filtering improperly. He was getting his first real look at them. They had been on the streets for a long time. Their clothes were worn stiff with dried rain and dirt. Sahar's dark hair, though still striking, had lost its shine beneath layers of grime. Even Nala's small hands bore the smudges of survival, her green skin dull by dust. Dustin sat down, his coffee with a sigh. All right, he said, pushing off the counter. First things first, you need a shower. Sahar's gaze napped up, her body immediately tensing. Excuse me, you heard me. Dustin saged, stirring toward the small bathroom tucked in the corner of the apartment. There's hot water, soap, towels. You should use them. Sahar's jaw tightened. We're fine, you're not. He crossed his arms, giving her a pointed look. I can smell both of you from here. Nala gasped, dramatically sniffing at her own arm. Doy stink. Dustin smirked a little. The little girl frowned, then turned to her mother. Mama, can we please? I want to be clean. Sahari inhaled sharply, torn between pride and necessity. Dustin didn't press further. He could already see the battle waging in her mind. The instinct to reject help. The ingrained belief that accepting kindness came with consequences. But this wasn't Carita, this was basic survival. Finally, Sahari let out a slow breath. Fine, Nala cheered, scrambling to her feet. Dustin pulled out two clean towels from a storage compartment and handed them over. There's a soap in there. The water pressure is a little aggressive, so don't let it knock you over. Nala grabbed the towels eagerly, her excitement outweighing any hesitation her mother had. Sahari, still tense, took them with far more caution. She didn't thank him, but she gave a small stiff nod before ushering her daughter toward the bathroom. The door closed behind them, and for the first time since they had entered his apartment, Dustin was alone. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. This wasn't what he had expected when he woke up yesterday. Hell, this wasn't what he had expected when he woke up this morning. He wasn't sure why he cared so much. He had spent years looking out for himself, avoiding unnecessary attachments. Yet there he was, making sure a mother and child, strangers had food, warmth, and now even a hot shower. Maybe it was because he saw something in them, a reflection of a past he didn't talk about. He shook it away and busied himself preparing something to eat. The food wasn't much, just rehydrated meal packs and a bit of dried fruit he had stashed away, but it was better than nothing. The sound of running water filled the apartment, a steady hum that somehow made the space feel different lived in. By the time the door finally reopened, a cloud of steam spilling into the cooler air. Nala emerged first, wrapped in an oversized towel, her damp green skin now fresh and vibrant. Dust. Look, she spread her arms dramatically. I'm all clean. He let out a low whistle. Much better. I almost didn't recognize you, she giggled, spinning in place before trotting over to the table. Sahari followed behind, her second towel wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her long black hair now wet and clinging to her skin framed her sharp features in a way that made her look almost like a different person. But what struck Dustin the most was how much more at ease she seemed. She was still guarded, still stiff, but some of the exhaustion that had clung to her like a second skin had washed away with the dirt. She met his gaze briefly before looking away. That was unnecessary, she muttered, but there was no real bite to the words. Maybe, Dustin admitted, setting a plate of food in front of Nala. But it didn't kill you, did it? She huffed, but sat down without further argument. Nala, fully invested in breakfast, eagerly grabbed her utensils. Dustin, this is stomach better than garbage food, she declared. Dustin snorted. I should hope so. Sahari picked at her meal with a bit more caution, though after the first bite her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. For the first time the silence was intense. It was comfortable. Nala, fully awake and full of energy, went right back to playing her space battle, her small hands making explosion noises as she knocked her makeshift captain against her grumpy mechanic. Boom, the captain dodges at the last second. Narrated, but the enemy ship is too fast. Dustin leaned back, watching her with an amused smirk. And where's the grumpy mechanic in all this? Nala grinned. He's fixing the ship because captains break everything. Sahari made a soft noise, almost a laugh. But not quite, Dustin chuckled. Smart kid. Nala beamed. And just like that, the apartment felt a little less empty. The apartment smelled different, not just of coffee and rehydrated meal packs, but of people, of warm skin and damp towels, of blankets that have been wrapped around a sleeping child, of something lingering in the air that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just a place anymore. It breathed. Dustin noticed it in the little things: Thescond, cup of tea sitting on the table, the small blanket bunched up on the couch where Nala had curled up earlier, the faint trace of steam still clinging to the air from their earlier shower. And he wasn't sure how he felt about it. He had spent years keeping his doors closed, letting people in, watching them leave, or worse. But here they were, still here. Across the room, Nala sat cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed in her imaginary battle. She had two mismatched tools in her hands, one held high like a triumphant hero, the other dangling limply in her lap. As if feet had suffered a terrible fate, Captain Zara dodges the asteroids. She declared, swinging the spaceship through the air. But the engines are failing. Mechanic Gus, fix it. She turned dramatically and shoved a rusted multi-tool into Dustin's hands. You're Gus, she announced, as if bestowing a great honor. Dustin raised an eyebrow. Thought I was just grumpy mechanic. Now you have a name, Nis said matter-of-factly, and a very important job from the table. Sahari let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite fitting. She murmured into her cup. Dustin shot her a look, then sighed, and turned the tool over in his hands, pretending to inspect it. All right, Captain, he said seriously. Looks like your power core is hot. Going to take at least 5 hours to fix. Nala gasped. 5 hours? We don't have it that long. We'll crash. Then you better hope I work fast. He crouched down beside her, frowning in mock concentration as he twisted an invisible bolt, adjusted a non-existent circuit, and tapped the tool against his palm like a seasoned engineer diagnosing a complex issue. Hand me the hydro spanner, he muttered. Nala blinked. What? A hydro spanner? Exactly. She giggled, delighted, and eagerly handed him another random tool from the pile she had gathered. Sahari shook her head. You're encouraging her. She asked me a job, Dustin replied with a shrug. I take my work very seriously. Nala beamed. You're officially part of the crew now. Dustin felt something shift inside him at they hadn't planned for any of this, hadn't expected to care. But here he was, playing along with a child's game as if it meant something. And maybe to her it did. All right, he said, straightening. Engines are back online, but you owe me a new power core, Nala saluted. I'll pay you in space credits. Dustin smirked. Only take snacks. She gasped, as if this was a very serious demon, then reached for a piece of dried fruit from her plate and carefully placed it in his palm. Deal, she said sullenly. Dustin popped the fruit into his mouth, chewing thoughtfully. Pleasure doing business with you, Captain? Sahari let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head. If for the first time since she had stepped into his apartment, she looked at ease. The rest of the morning fast and very unspoken comfort, Dustin busied himself tidying up. Not that there was much to clean. He lived simply. No clutter, no excess, just the essentials. And yet somehow, the space already felt fuller than it had the day before. After breakfast, he pulled out a few old blankets and set them on the couch. Figured you might want something softer than a pile of rations to sleep on, Hazade. Sahari hesitated, but took them without protest. Nala, meanwhile, had decided to explore every inch of the apartment. What's in here? She asked, pointing at a closed cabinet. Tools? And here, more tools. She wrinkled her nose. You need better stuff. Dustin huffed a quiet laugh. Yeah, well, I wasn't exactly expecting company. She seemed to accept that answer and continued her exploration, eventually settling back near Sahari, pressing into her mother's side. Dustin sat across from them, resting his forearms on his knees. So, he said, looking at Sahari, what's your plan? Her fingers curled slightly around the fabric of the blanket. We'll leave soon, she said. Right. Dustin wasn't sure why that confirmation made his chest feel heavier than it should. You don't have to rush, he said after a moment. It's not like I've about a waiting list of people trained to stay here. Sahar's golden eyes met his searching. Why do you care? Her voice wasn't sharp, wasn't accusatory, just cautious, wary. Dustin ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. Because I've been there, he admitted. Not exact like you, but close enough. Sahari didn't respond. Right away, but something in her posture shifted. Not trust, not yet, but maybe less resistance. Noli yawned, stretching her small arms before climbing onto the couch, curling into the blankets Dustin had given them. Mama, she mumbled sleepily, do we have to go? Sahar's expression faltered. Dustin pretended not to notice the way her fingers brushed against Nala's hair, the way her shoulders tensed to the question. Oh yet, she murmured. Nala hummed in response, already halfway to sleep. The quiet settled again, heavier this time. Dustin leaned back, looking at Saharians. More one night, she whispered, almost to herself. Dustin nodded. One night, but they both knew it wasn't true anymore. The soft hum of the climate unit filled the apartment, steady and rhythmic blending with the distant murmur of the city outside. The artificial lights beyond the window bathed the room in a muted glow, flickering against the metal walls. It was late enough that Vendaprime had slipped into its quieter hours. Though the planet never truly slept, Dustin sat at the small kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a half-empty mug of lukewarm coffee. Across from him Sahari was silent, her hands resting loosely around her own cup, her golden eyes unreadable as she stared at nothing. In particular, Nala had fallen asleep on the couch, buried beneath the blankets. Dustin had given her one small hand, peeked out fingers curled slightly in sleep, her slow, steady breathing the only real sign of peace in the room. They should have left by now, Sahari had said. One night she had told him, that this was temporary. But morning had passed, then afternoon, then evening, and still they hadn't moved. And neither of them had mentioned it. Dustin exhaled, sitting his mug down with a quiet clink. You're still here? Sahari tinned slightly, fingers of one hand curling around the edge of her cup. It's late. It wasn't an answer. Dustin leaned back, stretching his legs out in front of him, studying her. That's not why. Sahar's jaw tightened. She knew it. He knew it. But saying it aloud would make it real. A long pause stretched between them, neither of them willing to break it first. Finally, Sahara let out a slow breath, her shoulders sinking slightly. She's happy here. Shouldn't need to specify. Who? Dustin glanced at the couch, at the small bundle of warmth tucked beneath the blankets. Nala had settled into this space like it belonged to her, like she had already decided this was home. And maybe in some quiet and spoken way, Sahari had too. That a bad thing? Dustin asked. Sahari hesitated. It makes leaving harder. Her voice was quieter now, like she was admitting something she wasn't sure she wanted to. Dustin nodded slowly. So don't. Sahari let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head. You say that like it's simple. Maybe it is. For you, maybe. Dustin frowned, but before he could respond, Sahari continued, her voice measured but tight. I can't just pretend this is normal, that we belong here. You helped us, and I appreciate that. But Nala and I, were not. Exhaled sharply, gripping the cup between her fingers. We don't fit anywhere. Not in the streets. Not in the market. Not here. She seems to fit just fine, Dustin pointed out. Sahar's gaze flickered to her daughter, something complicated flashing across her expression. She's a child, she murmured. She doesn't understand how fragile this is, how quickly it can be taken away. Dustin's jaw tightened. Then maybe it's your job to make sure it isn't. Sahar's breath caught just for a second. There was that small crack in her armor, the moment of hesitation before she could rebuild her walls. Dustin didn't press further. He had learned a long time ago that some people needed space to walk toward their own decisions instead of being pushed. So he stood, stretching as he grabbed his now empty mug and walked toward the sink. Stay or go, he said, his voice even. It's your choice. I'm not keeping you here. Sahari watched him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Then finally she exhaled, slow and quiet. I know. Neither of them said anything else, and for now that was enough. Later that night, Dustin stirred from sleep at the sound of soft footsteps. He opened one eye, barely lifting his head from where he had dozed off in the chair near the window. Nala stood near the couch, half awake, blinking sleepily at him, her small hands clutched the edge of the blanket draped over her shoulders, her dark green skin illuminated softly by the glow of the city lights filtering through the window. Dustin, she mumbled. Yeah, his voice was raw with sleep. Can I have water? Dustin grunted in acknowledgement, pushing himself up and moving toward the kitchen, filled a small cup from the sink, then handed it to her. She took it carefully, drinking in slow, sleepy sips before handing it back. "Thank you," he nodded, but Nala didn't move. She stood there for a second, shifting slightly on her feet, hesitant. "Mama likes it here," she said finally. Dustin glanced toward the couch where Sahari still slept, curled slightly in her side. "Yeah," he said, keeping his voice quiet. Nala nodded. "She won't say it, but I know." Dustin studied the little girl, the way she spoke, with quiet certainty, as if she understood her mother better than Sahari understood herself. "You want to stay?" he asked. Nala hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Dustin sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You tell her that?" Nala shook her head. "She gets scared when I say things like that." Dustin frowned. "Why?" Nala shrugged, then yawned, rubbing at her eyes. "She's afraid of losing things, so she doesn't keep them." Something in Dustin's chest tightened. "Go back to sleep, kid," he said softly. Nala blinked up at him, then gave a sleepy smile. "Good night." Dustin didn't say back, just watched as she padded back toward the couch, curling into the warmth of her mother's side. Dustin exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck as he glanced toward the window. Maybe Sahari was afraid of keeping things, but that didn't mean she wasn't meant to. The soft hum of the city seeped through the apartment's thin walls, a steady rhythm of distant voices, hovering drones, and the occasional flicker of neon signs reflecting off damp metal surfaces. The artificial glow outside bathed the room in pale light, stretching long shadows across the floor, reaching toward the small couch where Sahar and Dala lay curled together beneath the blankets. Dustin sat at the table, arms folded, staring at nothing in particular. He should have been asleep, but something kept him awake. Maybe it was the conversation from earlier, the way Sahari had looked at him, like he had said something dangerous, like he had given her a choice she hadn't allowed herself to consider. Or maybe it was what Nala had whispered before shuffling back under the blankets. She's afraid of losing things, so she doesn't keep them. That thought dug into him deeper than it should have. Across the room, Sahari stirred. She shifted beneath the blanket, brow furrowing slightly before her golden eyes fluttered open. It took her a moment to remember where she was, her gaze flicking around the dimly lit space before landing on him. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then she carefully pushed herself up, moving quietly so she wouldn't wake Nala, and crossed the room toward him. "Ooh, don't sleep much, do you?" she murmured, her voice still heavy with exhaustion. "Not if I can help it." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, watching him. What? Dustin smirked, but there was no real amusement in it. "Old habit." Sahari studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the empty chair across from him before settling into it. "She talks about you." Dustin blinked, caught off guard. "Oh." Nala Sahar's fingers traced the rim of her empty cup, her movements slow, thoughtful. "She already trusts you." Dustin wasn't sure how to respond to that. He hadn't tried to earn the kids' trust. He had simply done what felt right. Given them food, a warm place to stay. Let Nala turn his apartment into a battleground for imaginary space wars. "Is that a problem?" he asked finally. Sahari let out a breath, her shoulders tightening. "It's unexpected." Dustin frowned. "Unexpected how?" Pio pleaded. "Usually stay." The words were quiet, matter of fact, as if she wasn't just talking about him but about everyone who had come before, not even her father. Dustin asked. Sahar's jaw tightened, her fingers stilling against the cup he left before she was old enough to remember him. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just a quiet, hollow sort of acceptance. "I used to tell her stories that he was out there somewhere trying to find us, that one day he'd come back." Dustin didn't have to ask what changed, and now Sahari looked toward the couch at the small sleeping bundle curled beneath the blankets. "Now she doesn't ask anymore." The weight of those words settled between them. Dustin exhaled, slowly leaning back in his chair. He had seen this before. Different names, different faces, but the same ache left behind, the same struggle to move forward while pretending not to look back. "You don't have to keep running," he said, Saharadan's. "I'm not running." Dustin tilted his head slightly, watching her. "Aren't you?" She flinched just slightly. He let the silence stretch, let her sit in it before he continued, his voice quieter now but firm. "You think if you don't hold on to something you can't lose it, that if you don't let yourself want anything it won't hurt when it's gone." His gaze and waver. "But that's not surviving, Sahara, that's just waiting to disappear." Sahar's breath hitched. She looked away, fingers tightening around the fabric of the blanket, her posture rigid, defensive. "It's not that simple," she murmured. "No," Dustin admitted, "but it's not as complicated as you make it either." Her jaw clenched. He could see it. The way she wanted to argue, the way she wanted to push him back to that safe distance where she kept everyone. But for the first time, Shouldn't she just sat there staring at her daughter and let the quiet settle around her? And for Dustin, that was enough. For no, the apartment was quiet, not the kind of empty silence Dustin was used to, but something softer, something filled with the slow rhythm of breathing, the quiet rustle of fabric, the warmth of another presence. Morning had come, though the artificial sky of Ennis Prime didn't offer much of sunrise. The city outside pulsed with its usual hum, but inside the world had slowed. Dustin sat at the small table, a cup of coffee cradle between his hands, watching as Sahara folded one of the blankets. Her movements were precise, careful, like she was trying to keep herself busy, like she was trying to convince herself she was leaving. Across the room, Nala was still asleep, curled into the couch, her tiny fingers twitching slightly as she dreamed. "You're still here," Dustin murmured. Sahar's hands still filled for half a second before Ish continued folding. "I know." Dustin exhaled through his nose, setting his cup down. "You not going, are you?" Sahari let out a breath, not looking at him. "I don't now." She stood there for a moment, staring at the neatly folded blanket in her hands, as if it held all the ants. Worse than. Finally, she sat down across from him, shoulders stiff. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly. Dustin didn't move, didn't say anything right away. He just let the words settle. "Of what?" He asked. Sahari swallowed. "Of stopping, of letting myself believe this is real, that it could last." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Every time I've let myself think we were safe, that we had something, it was taken away." Her voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. "If I don't let myself want this, then it won't hurt when it's gone." Dustin studied her carefully. "So that's it?" he asked. "You'd rather have nothing than risk losing something real?" Sahari flinched just slightly. "It's not that simple." "It is," Dustin said, his voice firm but quiet. "You'll keep running because it's easier than staying, but you don't have to. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, not to home, not to the people who turned their backs on you, and sure as hell not to the guy who left you behind." Sahar's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away this time. "You want to go," Dustin continued. "Fine, go, but don't pretend it's because you have to." The silence stretched between them, heavy, charged with something unspoken. Then slowly Sahari exhaled. "I don't want to go," she admitted, "but I don't know how to stay." Dustin leaned back slightly, watching her, then shook his head. "You're already doing it," he said. Sahari blinked. Dustin gestured toward Nala, still curled up on the couch, her tiny form nestled into the blankets like she belonged there. "She knows," he said simply. "She knew before you did." Sahari looked at her daughter, something flickering in her golden eyes. Then finally her shoulders loosened just slightly. Dustin let out a quiet breath and stood stretching before moving toward the kitchen. "Hungry?" he asked over his shoulder. Sahari hesitated, then softly, so softly he almost didn't hear it, she said, "Yeah, it wasn't much, but it was enough." Dustin noticed it in the way Sahari moved, not with the rigid tension she always carried, but with something softer, quieter, like she was finally allowing herself to exist here in this moment without bracing for it. Tobe taken away. Nala had fallen asleep again, curled up beneath the blankets on the couch, one hand loosely wrapped around the edge of the fabric. The slow, even rise and fall of her breathing filled the silence between them. Sahari stood near the small kitchen unit, her fingers grazing the rim of a cup she hadn't taken a sip from yet. Dustin leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest, watching her. "You're thinking too hard," he murmured. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "I didn't know how to stop." Dustin smirked, pushing off the counter. "Want me to hit you over the head? Might do the trick." Sahari shot him a dry look, but there was a flicker of something else in her expression, amusement, familiarism, and dangerous and fragile all at once. Dustin moved closer without thinking, not much, just a step, just enough that he could see the way her breathing changed, the way her fingers curled slightly against the counter. "I don't understand you," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I get that a lot." Sahari huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "No, you don't." Dustin tilted his head slightly. "Then explain it to me." She hesitated, her golden eyes flickering over his face like she was searching for something. "You're not afraid of this?" Dustin frowned. "Of what?" Sahari swallowed off, wanting something. "Ah, so that was what this was about." Dustin let out a slow breath, considering his words carefully. "I used to be," he admitted, "used to think keeping people at a distance was easier, safer." Sahari gaze didn't waver, and now Dustin shrugged, but there was no nonchalance in it, just quiet honesty. "Now I think some things are worth their risk." Silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them were saying. Then slowly, cautiously, Sahar reached out, just a small movement, her fingers brushing against his forearm, the touch barely there, But it was enough. Dustin inhaled sharply, his pulse kicking up in a way he hadn't expected. She didn't pull away, neither did he. This is dangerous, she murmured, but there was no real warning in her voice. Dustin smirked, his voice low. I thought you like dangerous things. Sahari exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. You're an idiot. Yeah. His hand lifted almost on instinct, fingers ghosting over her wrist, tracing the warmth of her skin. But you're still standing here. She was, and that was the only answer he needed. The space between them disappeared in slow, deliberate inches. No hesitation, no second guessing. Just the inevitable pull-off, something they had both been circling for far too long. Dustin didn't rush it, didn't press. He just let it happen. Her lips met his, soft and hesitant. He felt something settle deep in his chest, something quiet and certain, something that tasted a lot like home. The scent of something warm and familiar pulled Dustin from sleep before the soft hum of the city fully registered. It wasn't the usual sterile scent of rehydrated meal packs or stale coffee. No, this was different, richer, fuller. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then, as last traces of sleep faded, he heard the quiet clinking of dishes, the hushed sound of movement from the small kitchen unit. Sahari. Dustin blinked, rubbing a hand over his face before pushing himself up. The blanket that had been draped over him slipped down to the floor. He didn't even remember pulling it over himself the night before. With a yawn, he stood and stretched before making his way toward the kitchen, the scent of food growing stronger. There she was. Sahari stood by the small stove, her back to him, long dark hair still slightly tousled from sleep. She moved with quiet focus, stirring something in a pan while steam curled up into the air. Nala was perched on a chair nearby, swinging her legs back and forth as she walked with bright eyes. Mama's making breakfast, she announced proudly, noticing Dustin. Before Sahari did, Sahari glanced over her shoulder, a hint of something softer in her expression. It's not much, said almost shrilly, but you fed us enough times. I thought I'd return the favor. Dustin smirked, leaning against the doorway. I didn't know you could cook. Sahari rolled her eyes, turning back to the stove. I managed just fine before you came along. Human. Sure you did, she huffed, but didn't argue. Dustin took a slow breath, letting the scene settle into him, imprinted self in his mind. This was new, different. He wasn't used to waking up to this, the warmth of someone else moving through his space like they belonged there, at the easy rhythm of shared silence of a morning that didn't feel rushed or uncertain. It felt natural, it felt right. He stepped closer, resting a hand lightly against the small of Sahar's back as he peered over her shoulder at the pan. Smells good. She stiffened for just a second at the touch, then almost imperceptibly leaned into it. You'll eat anything, she murmured. But there was no bite in her words. True, Dustin admitted, letting his fingers brush against her waist before he pulled away. Sahari shot him a glance, half amused, half exasperated, but there was something else in her gaze too, something softer, something. She wasn't running from anymore. Nala, watching the exchange, grinned. We're a good family now, she declared, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Dustin blinked. Sahari inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening slightly on the spoon she was holding. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then slowly Sahari turned, meeting Dustin's gaze. She's not wrong, he murmured. Sahara swallowed, something unreadable flickering across her expression. And then, before she could second guess herself, before she could retreat into old habits, she leaned in. It was soft, tentative, barely more than a brush of lips, a quiet confirmation of something that had been there for longer than either of them had been willing to admit. When she pulled away, Dustin exhaled, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I could get used to this, Sahari huffed, shaking her head, but the warmth in her gaze betrayed her. Eat your breakfast, human. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't running, they were home.